welcome back to another edition of our live chats with our astronomer, Rachel. Hey, Rachel, how's it going? Coming on in here with your video.
Hello, hi.
Already out in space, I can see, which is great for this week's theme, which is all about living in space. And, you know, we picked this theme for this week for a reason, because yesterday was going to be a historic day for a launch of a brand new rocket that was going to be launching from North America for the first time since 2011. That was the SpaceX Crew Dragon, which was unfortunately delayed because of bad weather. So that launch is going to be on Saturday now, around noonish time. So this is a preview of what's going to happen, but it's really significant. This is going to change, you know, space flights for the next generation, because SpaceX, of course, is a private company that will enable space flight to be so much cheaper. So we're using this week's theme to kind of think about, you know, humans in space and the challenges of living in space. And Rachel has got a little bit of a presentation for us that's going to start us off. And then we're going to get to all of your questions out there in YouTube land. So make sure to use the chat, type in your comments. You can let us know if you try to watch the SpaceX and if you plan to watch on Saturday, and perhaps where you're viewing from as well today. And we'll probably tackle most of the living in space questions first. So if you have any of those, put those into the chat, and then we'll open it up to any kind of space questions we got out there. So let's get going with this week, living in space. Take it away, Rachel.
Thank you. So I'm just loading my screen share right now. Michael, if you want to give me a thumbs up when you see what looks like a cartoon version of the Tesla Roadster in space.
Yeah, you're good to go.
Awesome. All right, so what is it like to live in space? Now, like every other living creature that we know of, humans evolved in the presence of Earth's gravity. So it's not that surprising that our bodies would behave a little bit oddly while in orbit. Now, back in 1961, Soviet scientists were very worried that any prolonged period of weightlessness would be fatal, which is actually why they limited Yuri Gagarin's first space flight to just a single orbit of 108 minutes. Now, dealing with weightlessness is the most important and obvious influence of living in space. From eating to sleeping, from working to going to the bathroom, weightlessness makes doing all these things much more complicated. Astronauts on the ISS experience something called microgravity, and the effects of which can be seen when astronauts float in space. Oh, bringing my PowerPoint back here. Well, micro means very small, so microgravity must refer to the condition where gravity seems to be very small. Now, microgravity is often called zero gravity, but that's kind of misleading because they're not the same thing. There's a misconception that there's no gravity in space, but in fact, a small amount of gravity can be found everywhere in space. Gravity holds the moon in orbit around the Earth in orbit around the sun, and the sun in place in the Milky Way galaxy. Now, the International Space Station, or the ISS, orbits the Earth at an altitude of around 400 kilometers up in the air. Now, at this altitude, Earth's gravity is about 90% of what it is on the planet's surface, which means that if you weighed 100 pounds on Earth and climbed the ladder all the way to the space station, you would weigh 90 pounds at the top of the ladder. Ooh, it looks like something weird is going on with my PowerPoint here. So let me just stop screen sharing and see if I can reload this really quickly. Michael, do you have any questions for me while I'm reloading?
Did you attempt to watch the Dragon launch yesterday?
I did, yeah. I watched the full stream. I was a little disappointed that they canceled it, but you know what? It was a good thing because they were all systems go otherwise. So it was just the weather. So I'm hoping that this Saturday we'll have a little bit more sunshine, less clouds, less electricity in the atmosphere. So maybe they'll be able to launch it then.
What do you think of the new spacesuits? Because SpaceX, of course, is designing a whole new design, and the spacesuits look pretty cool.
Yeah, and I appreciate the redesign, you know, because when we first went up into space, all the spacesuits were built for men. You know, they were sized M, L, XL, and for a woman to be in it or a female to be in it, it was almost like swimming in a massive spacesuit. So it's really cool that they're doing this redesign and making sure that, especially with the first female walking on the lunar surface, that she'll be able to fit inside her spacesuit.
Yeah, so awesome. All right, looks like we got your presentation back.
Oh, awesome. Okay, so back from outer space. Well, we know that microgravity affects just about everything in the human body. So let's talk about some of the differences between how the body functions here on Earth and how it functions in space. Now, as you can imagine, our sense of balance is severely impacted while in space. Our sense of balance depends on key motion sensors or organs that are located inside your inner ear. Now, these function as ultra-sensitive accelerometers that feed the brain with information on motion and direction. Now, in the absence of gravity, signals coming from the inner ear are wildly misleading, which usually leads to astronauts feeling very disoriented, not knowing which way is up, which way is down, and even having difficulty sensing the location of their own arms and legs. Now, the GIF here shows people in an airplane nicknamed the Vomit Comet. And the Vomit Comet, what it does is it flies in these parabolic arcs that give you a feeling of weightlessness, almost like you would feel in your stomach on a roller coaster as it goes up and down. Now, NASA astronauts use things like the Vomit Comet to help acclimate themselves to the effects of space adaptation syndrome. Now, another problem to deal with is fluids, because almost 2/3 of your average body weight is water in some shape or form. Now, on Earth, this liquid is affected by gravity and it settles downwards in the body. But in space, these fluids actually migrate from the legs to the head. So within a day in space, your legs will shrink and your face will start to puff up. Now, the extra fluid in the head also leads to blocked sinuses, or what astronauts call the space sniffles. Now, since the body no longer needs to pump as hard to move blood around the body, the heart muscles actually start to shrink. Now, although exercise is not enough to reverse that process fully, it does help minimize it and provide some relief from these space sniffles. Finally, one of the major obstacles to long-term space missions is the severe bone loss in astronauts. In the microgravity environment of space, astronauts lose on average 1 to 2% of their bone mineral density every month as it gets reabsorbed by the body. This missing bone shows up as high calcium levels elsewhere in the body, which can lead to health problems like kidney stones. Now, bone loss does stop when astronauts return to Earth, but no one is really fully sure whether that lost bone will fully regenerate. And since bone loss in space is similar to the disease called osteoporosis here on Earth, astronauts will not be the only people to benefit from research into this problem. So now that we know the effects of living in space long term, let's talk about what a day in the life of an astronaut is like. Now, notice that I put day in quotation marks, and that's because the concept of a day aboard an orbiting spacecraft is a little bit abstract. Every 24 hours, astronauts on board the ISS will experience 16 sunrises and sunsets because the ISS orbits the Earth every 90 minutes. So here's a brief outline of what a day on the ISS looks like. The crew are awoken by alarm each morning and climb out of their sleeping bags that are attached to the wall to prevent them from floating away while they sleep. They get dressed, wearing disposable clothes that get replaced every 3 days, because remember, there are no washing machines in space. Astronauts wash up with wet towels, as there's no showers either. Then comes the first of 3 meals of the day. Drinks and soup are served in plastic bags to be sipped with straws. Magnets and Velcro keep utensils from floating away from the dining table. Now, staying too long in a microgravity environment actually dulls your sense of taste, so spicy food tends to be a crew favorite. Now, after eating, astronauts settle down to the assigned tasks of the day, either supervising experiments or performing routine maintenance on equipment. Now, a less stressful daily routine involves exercise. A few hours of daily exercise helps keep the muscles healthy and provides relief from the space sniffles. The ISS has a treadmill and an exercise bike that astronauts strap themselves down to. And now, since it's been heavily featured in the news, I wanted to mention a little bit about NASA's SpaceX Demo 2 mission, which will launch 2 American astronauts, Robert Behnken and Douglas Hurley, to the International Space Station as part of NASA's Commercial Crew program. As a final flight test for SpaceX, this mission will validate the company's crew transportation system, including things like the launch pad, the rocket, the spacecraft, and operational capabilities. This will also be the first time that NASA astronauts will test their spacecraft systems while in orbit. Okay, so what happened to the launch that was scheduled yesterday? Well, the mission was actually aborted due to weather. There was a concern that if they did launch, it could actually trigger lightning. Now, the phenomena of triggered lightning by a spacecraft was first experienced in 1969, when Apollo 12 launched through clouds with a weak electrical field. The spacecraft ended up triggering 2 electrical strikes, even though no natural lightning was present. Now, this happened because the launch vehicle and its plume act as conductors that channel electrical charges, And that's essentially what lightning is. It's the transfer or discharge of electrical charge. Now, the goal of the mission is to complete the validation process for human-rated spaceflight operations on SpaceX hardware. If successful, the demonstration flight will give the green light for the Crew Dragon spacecraft, the Falcon 9 rocket, the Crew Transportation System, and SpaceX's overall capabilities. Now, the spacecraft will be put on an intercept course with the ISS, where it'll test various control systems whilst in orbit. And about 24 hours later, Crew Dragon will dock autonomously with the space station, and Benken and Hurley will become members of the Expedition 63 crew. Aboard the space station, they will perform tests on Crew Dragon and conduct research and other tasks with the space station crew already there. Now, as Michael said, the new launch date is set for this Saturday, so make sure you tune into NASA Live on May 30th. And that brings us to the end of my talk. So Michael, let's get started on the Q&A.
Awesome, Rachel. So just like we did in the previous weeks, hopefully you can put some questions in the chat. I'll start off with some questions, Rachel. I learned actually a few new things watching the stream yesterday. So one of the things obviously was seeing how everyone was still social distancing. All the SpaceX employees, they had masks on as they were seeing the astronauts in, which of course is very important for those astronauts going up to a pristine environment up there. But the other thing was when they were talking about the weather conditions and sort of the decision making that goes into why, and you sort of explain sort of like some of the dangers, but also that they're looking ahead to the weather over the ocean for when the crew does return, because of course Bob and Doug, those two astronauts that were going to go to the International Space Station, were also going to come back down in the top of the Crew Dragon in a parachute and fall into the ocean. So of course the weather around that ocean is super important as well. So all of those go into the decisions to delay it, and of course always safety first. This is, you get one shot at something, and if something goes wrong, it's not good.
Yeah, that's a great point, because human lives are at stake, right? We're not launching robots or rovers to the International Space Station. We're launching actual people, so we want to make sure that we have the most pristine conditions as possible.
Yeah. And then when they do get up to space, some of my favorite facts are that astronauts get to bring up their own special food. It does get a little bit lonely up in space. You're isolated, you're away from your family. And so every astronaut, gets to bring some personal items, but they also get to bring up, a favorite food as well. So if you were going to go up into the space station, Rachel, what would be your food that you would bring?
So astronauts on the ISS get a few food items that don't have to be dehydrated. And one of those food items that comes in its natural form is actually brownies. So I think that I would bring just a whole sheet pan of double fudge chocolate brownies up to the ISS, because that, I think, would be what I would miss the most.
Wow. I don't know if I don't know if they'd allow brownies up there. They seem pretty crumbly that they would get.
They do. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see if they let me bring it up or not.
Let's stick with the Dragon X questions. We got some questions coming in. Mark Frank, do you know how much it costs them to move a launch? So obviously it probably cost a lot of money just to get set up in the first place.
Interesting. That's a really good question. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but I am thinking that even in terms of man hours, having people there, even the liquid oxygen, we saw that some of the liquid oxygen was coming off as we were waiting, and that is really expensive in itself, as you can imagine. But you know what, the cost of delaying a mission like this is really nothing compared to making sure that everything is safe.
Right. And following up on that and talking about costs, one of the major advantages of using a company like SpaceX is that they've been developing reusable rockets. But this particular one, so is the Dragon X, is it a reusable rocket?
I believe it is, off the top of my head, if I recall correctly.
So after they would have launched up, we would have seen that the bottom half of the rocket land back down on the capsule?
Mm-hmm. Yes, in theory.
That is cool.
Yeah, and I really think that's the future of space travel, or even transporting space cargo, is having reusable rockets like SpaceX is doing to not contribute to the problem of space debris that we have right now.
Yeah. Let's go back into living on a space station. We had a question earlier about sleeping in space, and we quite often see the astronauts sleeping vertically. And I'm not sure if that's just because of perspective. Do you know, do they always sleep vertically?
It really doesn't matter actually which direction they sleep in because it's all the same to them in that microgravity environment. So it's just as easy to sleep horizontally as it is vertically. So it's really about what's the most space efficient way to tuck in an astronaut as they sleep for those 8 hours.
Yeah, I've never actually seen like I need to go on like a more detailed tour through the ISS because I wonder like, so you can think about sort of like the round capsule that they're sort of, you always see them floating through, and in their bedroom quarters, you know, there'll be an astronaut up here, but is there also an astronaut over here? Like if they got detached, would they like run into each other?
Definitely. I can imagine that there would be a lot of hijinks happening if they were able to float while they were sleeping, maybe float into and get sucked into an air ventilator or something like that.
Yeah. So it's pretty important that when they do get into those little sleeping capsules that they strap themselves in, right?
Yes, yeah. Everything should be strapped down when you're in this free floating environment.
Because even when we're sleeping, we're still breathing, and even our breath, you know, would actually give us some momentum, you know, away from wherever we were.
Exactly, almost like a balloon. Yeah, some sort of thrust from your breath.
And then, of course, you know, if you got some gas, you know, if you got a burp, you got a fart, you know, I mean, then it's bad.
Chaos.
Yeah. Let's also think about living in space. You know, the International Space Station is where astronauts are going now. In the future, where do you envision humans going to? There's a question about if there's a possibility of setting up some temporary residences on asteroids, maybe.
Oh, interesting. Right, so that brings us back almost to when we were talking about the different spacesuits, and I mentioned that the first female was going to walk on the lunar surface in 2024. So that is part of a project called the Lunar Gateway, and that's basically this ISS-like space station that will be built around the moon and orbit around the moon. And what's different about the Lunar Gateway than the ISS is that it's going to be fully autonomous. So hopefully we won't have to have a continuous crew on board the space station like we do on the ISS. So the Lunar Gateway should be able to operate on its own fully autonomously. And the hope for that is that we can use that as a launching point, not only down to the lunar surface where we can conduct science experiments at will whenever, but we're also hoping that it'll be a launching pad or a stepping stone to future deeper space missions, perhaps like places like Mars or having to colonize Mars. It'd be really helpful not to go straight from Earth there. It's helpful to get that extra little step already launching from the Lunar Gateway around the moon.
Interesting. Another question come in from, this is a really interesting one, because of course here in British Columbia, in Vancouver, we use Pacific Standard Time. And of course, if we're talking with our friends in Toronto, they're using Eastern Standard Time. So what time would the astronauts be using as they are orbiting our Earth?
Ooh, I believe that they would use UTC, which is Universal Coordinated Time, which is just a standardized time for no matter where you are on the Earth. I'm not 100% sure if that's the one that they use, but in my head, that would make the most sense.
It always seems that the UTC, that's what most astronomers would use. And I wonder if they would start to use that even before they left, even before they left the planet. That's an interesting question. I wonder if.
Well, especially because like UTC is based on atomic clocks, and that's actually what they use to synchronize all the data when they took a picture of the black hole with the Event Horizon telescope collaboration. They used atomic clocks as well, just because, you know, when you do have astronauts on the ISS, they are actually further outside of the gravitational potential well. So we do have effects like time dilation happening. And we see that with things like GPS satellites that go around. They do have to account for Einstein's relativity effects and time dilation. So it would make sense that they would use something that's based on atomic clocks to be as precise as possible.
Cool. And about how long does it take? We got a question in about how long it takes to get to the International Space Station. So if we were to continue watching on Saturday, it will take. We would be able to see them eventually arrive at the International Space Station, right?
Yes, yeah, I believe from leaving Earth to actually getting on board the International Space Station, it should take around 2 days, maybe less. But there are a lot of procedures, and they are doing tests while in orbit, while they're on that intercept trajectory as well. So there will be some delay going from Earth to ISS.
Right. And then eventually those astronauts are going to come back down and then land in the ocean.
Exactly.
Cool. It's going to be a fun day on Saturday if
Yeah.
that all works out. Another question in about the effects, of course, of being in space on our bodies. And of course, one of the things that I have a problem with is a sore back. And a large part of that is because gravity is pushing down on me. So what sort of would being in that type of environment, would that ease, the pains that I would have on my back? And other ailments, like my knees and elbows and joints and things like that.
I was gonna say that those are old person ailments, but I didn't want to say that.
It's all right.
But yeah, exactly. So you can think of gravity as a compressive force, right? So if you think about your spinal column, when you go into space, your spinal column actually elongates by anywhere from 5 to 7 centimeters. So you would get to be a little bit taller and not experience as much force that's squishing your spine down every day. And you kind of experience that as well when you go to sleep. Your spinal column relaxes a little bit, gets a tiny bit longer. And in space, the effects of that are much more.
Wow. And this would, of course, would even be more accentuated the longer time that we spend in space. Currently going to the International Space Station and back, but going to the moon, going to Mars, what do you think will be the major challenges to our human body for long duration space flights?
It comes to mind is dealing with supporting life. So having necessary things like water and food and figuring out how to bring those in a cost efficient way that doesn't cost, tens of thousands of dollars per kilogram to bring up. But also we have to think about radiation coming from our sun, right? So if you're exposed, you do have some of that radiation that's going to, hit your skin and whatnot. And they have protection for that on the ISS. So we have to make sure we have the same kind of measures in place when traveling to places like Mars that have an ultra thin atmosphere that don't provide that sort of same level of protection that we do have here on Earth.
Yeah. Another interesting question that's sort of like a sidebar, it is about humans in space, because of course here on this planet we have laws, we have regulations because of the country that we live in, but in space, how does laws and things like that work in space?
So I believe if a crime is committed in space, let's say on the ISS, you will be tried in your resident country. So whatever country you came from, you would be tried there. So it doesn't matter what program you're part of, whether it's NASA, the European Space Agency, or it's the Canadian Space Agency, you're just tried wherever you're from. And we did have the Outer Space Treaty in 1967 that was formed around the time that we went to the moon. But I'm hoping that we'll have better laws in place for handling things like space debris or colonizing other planets. I think that's really necessary and a talk that we should be having sooner rather than later.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, where that's really, I think, going to come into play, I don't think somebody robbing somebody on the International Space Station is really going to be a problem. But probably what we're looking at here is, say, two countries' satellites that maybe they crash into each other, and maybe like on the highway somebody is at fault there. But of course, it's not just those two countries. It's basically all of the other satellites that then come into play. So, there's a question about space lawyers, and there is lots of space policy out there being developed for this exact reason, because it is such a big deal right now that could have some large ramifications.
Yeah, perhaps space insurance is the next big field.
Let's keep going can you create artificial gravity on a space station?
Can you create artificial gravity? I think that this question is asking about kind of those sci-fi massive turning space stations. And so this actually, I'm going to bring it back to Einstein and his thought experiments, or in German, he called them Gedanken experiments. And anyone who's fluent in German that's listening can definitely laugh quietly at me for my pronunciation. But his idea was that it's impossible to tell whether or not you are in a closed box on Earth, feeling the gravity, the acceleration due to gravity on Earth, or if you are zooming around in a spaceship that's also accelerating at that same level, at the same acceleration of gravity that you feel here on Earth. It's impossible to tell whether or not it's an accelerating spacecraft or you're on the surface of our planet. And that kind of same idea would apply to space stations. So if we had a space station that was accelerating, let's say it had no windows, at g, at 9.8 meters per second squared, it would be no way to tell whether or not you were on the surface of Earth or you were in that spacecraft. So for sure, there's definitely ways to create artificial gravity. My concern would be whether or not that is the usability of it, or how well that would work versus whether or not it's actually needed, right? So astronauts can deal with the microgravity environment. They've done so for some cases over a year on the ISS, and it seems to be no problem. So it seems like they function okay in microgravity and not needing all the complex mechanics of figuring out artificial gravity quite yet.
Right. Yeah. And it would, that question of why they would need it, is a good one, and probably thinking about where they're going, perhaps they might need to acclimatize a bit, say, if you're going to Mars. Now, Mars doesn't have as much gravity as, say, Earth does, but it does have some. And I can sort of picture, say if we do send humans to Mars, maybe they need to kind of like gear up for like a little bit of a gravity change, because when astronauts come back to Earth after the space station, they've got some problems walking and stumbling around, which I can relate to because I'm a bit clumsy myself.
I love the videos of astronauts when they just return, where they go out and they hold a cup and they just drop it because they expect that it's going to float, but it just falls to the ground because of gravity.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's almost one last question about how, well, this one's a bit of a dangerous one. So would returning to space be possible if space debris was heading towards the International Space Station? Is there an evacuation plan?
Interesting. In the case of space aliens or space invaders, I'm sure that, so NASA has the ability to track space debris as it's orbiting our Earth. And what they do is they try to, if there are any chunks of space debris that are on that intercept trajectory with the ISS, they just try to blast it to change their orbit. So we talked about this before, the idea of either using laser ablations, of firing lasers at it to try to push it higher up in its orbit, or whatever, just trying to alter its trajectory before it gets there.
Right.
Yeah.
So avoiding rather than escaping.
Exactly.
Interesting. And apparently I did hear that Chris Hadfield, apparently when he was the commander, they had to do a small maneuvering procedure to avoid something. Wasn't a big deal, but something that they definitely had to do, or else it would have been bad news for the space station.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. We're almost at the end of our time. Thank you to everyone on the YouTube chat. We have a special announcement because next week we've got a fun event. We are doing our Cosmic Nights again, which means we're going to delve deep into the topic of black holes. We're also going to be doing our live chat also on black holes next Thursday at 2 o'clock. But Cosmic Nights is going to be on Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. We're going to be releasing that. Check our website for the information on how to sign up for Cosmic Nights. And we are going to have special guest Natalie Willette from out East McGill University. And we're going to be delving into everything black holes, because everyone loves black holes, right, Rachel?
Yes, it's my favorite topic.
And thank you so much for joining us. If you could go to our website and please donate. If you have anything to give, we really appreciate it. We also have a survey in the YouTube description that you can go and let us know about what you like about these live chats, any topics that you'd like to hear from. We also have resources that you can delve in deeper to the topic. We've got blogs about this topic this week, of course, living in space, next week, black holes. Check that out on our website. So for me, I'm Michael. See you next time.